Hello and welcome. I'm Shelby Magid, Deputy Director of the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center. Thank you for joining us online and for our audience in person and for our wonderful panel online and in person as well. We've got a very interesting and timely event today titled Russia's Big Prisoner Swap, Political Repression and Regressive Foreign Policy. So this is a timely event, and I want to give a little bit of background because we've actually shifted to evolve this event, and for once, it's for a good reason. For background, this panel was planned weeks ago with Evgenia Kara-Murza, Advocacy Director at the Free Russia Foundation and wife of then-in-prison Vladimir Kara-Murza. It was planned then to highlight the situation for Vladimir and other political prisoners in Russia. Evgenia was going to participate, and as you might notice, she is not here today in a fantastic and shocking turn of events because there was the prisoner swap on August 1st, and Vladimir was part of it. So she has now gone to see him and reunite her children with him and their family, and that was more pressing than our event, but we are grateful for her partnership and collaboration with us and for all her work and her husband's. But while Vladimir is released, as well as journalists Evan Gershkovich and also Kurmasheva and former U.S. Marine Paul Whelan, there are still countless other political prisoners behind bars in Russia and criminal Russian tactics to discuss along with our coverage of this prisoner swap. So we've got a great panel here today to discuss these issues, and it's my pleasure to introduce them. We have Nicole Bibin-Sadaka, interim president of Freedom House, and I want to shout out Freedom House for all their work and coverage of these issues. We've got Christian Carroll, former editor with the Washington Post's opinion section, Lena Gozman joining us online, a Russian opposition politician, and last but not least, Ambassador John Herbst, senior director of the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center. We're going to start with questions to our panelists, and then later we'll move to audience questions. If you're in person, we've got a microphone to the side that you can ask your questions at. And if you're online, you can submit your questions at askac.org. Again, that is askac.org. All right, Ambassador Herbst, we're going to start with you. The prisoner swap involving innocents, Kremlin spies and assassins, and political oppositionists was a very unusual and complex deal. Why do you think the Kremlin agreed to the inclusion of Vladimir Kara-Murza and Ilya Yashin? And what do you think of the reports that prior to his death in a Russian prison earlier this year, Navalny was also in the discussion? What, if anything, does this tell us about the politics today in Putin's Russia?
All right. First, when I think about this issue, I recall something that the great Russian historian Khrushchevsky wrote. It was something like that: when Russia marches abroad, the Russian people suffer. And in a sense, that quotation gets to the heart of the event that you've organized today. What is the relationship between the ongoing repression, increasing repression in Russia, which includes the taking of Western hostages? It includes the greater measures against Russian opposition figures, which have filled Russian jails, and it relates to the war. And the answer is that Putin's aggression drives that domestic repression. And so we've come to this, I have to say, extraordinary. I mean, I've been watching Moscow's foreign policy for 50 years now, 45 years now. And I've witnessed many prisoner exchanges, many spy swaps. But this one is truly unusual in its complexity, its numbers, and its scope. So you asked me why Yashin and Kara-Murza involved in this. Well, I think it all comes back to Putin's principal objective. There would have been no spy swap. And you have to credit the Biden administration for working on this ever since they got Brittany Griner released. They worked on it without success for years, literally, for one very important reason. And that is Putin's idée fixe was the release of his assassin, Krasikov, from a German jail. And so we, the Americans, were trying to get Americans freed, but we didn't have Putin's principal object. The Germans did, and they were saying no. So the key to this deal was Germany's agreement to release Krasikov. And I think the reason that happened, I can't be certain, is because they suddenly got skin in the game when Lukashenko arrested in Belarus last fall a German citizen, Krieger, who was also part of this deal. So that kind of unlocked the possibility of an exchange. But how do you manage this exchange, a very unusual, again, collection of people? And I think to make this more attractive to the West, because Putin was getting what he wanted, was to include Russian opposition figures. I think that's how Kara-Murza and Yashin and Pivovarov got involved in this, became part of this. So it's a long answer to your question, but I think that's how we got here.
And what, if anything, does this tell us about the politics in Putin's Russia?
Well, it's interesting. He's a monster. There's no doubt about it. What he's done to the Russian people, but even more to the Ukrainian people, in this savage war that borders on genocide, is truly horrifying. But there are some things he values. And there are individuals to whom he feels an obligation. In this case, it was Krasikov. And when he feels an obligation to that person, he is sometimes willing to give up more than, say, other people think he gets. We saw the same thing with that large prisoner exchange with Ukraine, I don't know, a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, where they sent many Azov battalion fighters who performed heroically defending Mariupol. I think 215 Ukrainian prisoners were released, lots of the Azov battalion folks, because Putin really wanted to get back his Ukrainian pal, Medvedchuk, who was in jail, who at that point had been in jail for a few months. So this is a Putin weakness, which we should be thinking about exploiting. Because right now, in the area of Russian willingness, because the leadership is savage, to seize Western hostages, it's an asymmetric game to our disadvantage. We have to figure out a way to make this a symmetric game.
Thank you very much. Dr. Gozman, thank you for joining us. You left Russia in 2022 after serving 2 consecutive 15-day terms in jail, and you have openly opposed Russia's war of aggression in Ukraine. Since leaving, you have been sentenced in absentia to 8.5 years behind bars. From your personal experiences and your knowledge of the Kremlin's actions domestically, could you detail the tactics Putin and the Russian authorities used to target dissent, and how these tactics have changed or evolved since the Kremlin launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine?
Thank you so much. It's a great pleasure and an honor for me to be with you in the Atlantic Council. And the prison in absentia reminds me an old Jewish joke, when a Jew was told that people spoke negative about him in his absence. He replied, "In my absence, they can even beat me." Okay, we'll overcome it. But let me, before answering your question, let me say a couple of words about this fantastic swap, this fantastic exchange. My congratulations, of course, to everybody and to everybody who were released now and everybody who organized it. And thanks to the leader of the West, President Biden, Chancellor Scholz, and so on. But the fact, I would like to pay attention to one very important fact of this swap. They changed not only their citizens, but our citizens as well, our citizens. And this means that they recognize, the leaders of the West, in my mind, that they recognized at least three very important facts. Fact number one, there is no separate war in Ukraine, no separate interference by Putin to the US elections, no separate war by Putin against freedom in Russia. It's all the one war against the world civilization. They are just different fronts of this war. And fact number two, for me, which is important for me, this means that our freedom fighters are fighting not only for their country, but like Ukrainian soldiers, they are fighting for the entire civilized world. And the third fact, the West recognized our political prisoners as its allies who were captured by the enemy. And this recognition gives a chance to 1,500 of our political prisoners who are still in prison. 1,500 at least, maybe several thousands, nobody knows exactly. These prisoners are those people who voluntarily and consciously, understanding all the risks, sacrifice their freedom for the freedom of other people. There are those people who are in the full power of Putin and others. Just several days ago, another of them, Pavel Kushnir, was killed, practically was killed in prison. And look, Putin wants a break. He wants a break. He asks for negotiations, directly and indirectly. And sooner or later, it will be some kind of agreement. And I believe that one of the points of this agreement should be Putin's release of the allies of the world civilization, our political prisoners, and the abolition of repressive legislation. On the part of the West, such a demand would be not just an act of humanity, but also a step toward ensuring its own Western security. Putin's war against these people is also a war against the West. Ukraine needs to be helped with weapons, and our freedom fighters needs legal and moral support. And thanks again to everyone who made it possible. And for your question, if I may, very briefly. Putin's regime stands not only on repressions, mainly it stands on lies, on creating an illusions, creating artificial world. In this artificial world, the whole world is against Mother Russia. We are the best. Everyone in Russia who are against the government is the agent of the foreign state. In general, this is quite a Hitler's picture of the world. It's the ideology of Nazis. Russian dissidents in Soviet period and now, they are telling the truth. They try to explain to their fellow citizens the reality, the real world. In the initial period of Putin, the government tried to discuss with them. This discussion was absolutely dishonest. 10 speakers from their side, 1 speaker from our side, to switching off the microphones, and so on and so on. But it was discussion. But they realized that they were losing anyway. And after this understanding, they moved to the direct repressions. Well, after the full-scale invasion to Ukraine, they began to repress not only those who say something, and especially those who do something, but also those who think the wrong way, just think the wrong way. Today, you can find yourself in prison, even when you said nothing, but simply disagree with them. And for example, if you read in subway, if you read the book which they think is the wrong book, you can be in prison. And this system rapidly moving from authoritarian to totalitarian. And the aim of this system now is to control not only behavior, but thoughts and feelings. That's it.
Thank you for that very powerful answer. And we appreciate all your advocacy as well. Now, Christian, turning to you. You were an editor for Now Freed, which I love to say, Vladimir Kara-Murza, when he won a Pulitzer Prize for commentary. When Evan Gershkovich stepped back on American soil last week. He told reporters that it was great to see Russian political prisoners freed as well as American and German political prisoners in the swap that secured his own release. What does the release of Russian political prisoners detained by their own leaders suggest about the U.S. and its partners' approach to negotiations and more broadly to democratic advocacy?
Well, look, I would argue that this was a big moment for democratic advocacy because, there are a lot of legitimate critiques of this kind of prisoner exchange. We know them. I think we're all familiar with them. Those are always the concerns that people have when some sort of exchange like this is performed with an authoritarian regime. I think this is a big moment for democratic advocacy because despite a lot of incorrect things in the reporting about this exchange, I was really struck by how well one fundamental truth came through in the coverage, which was that the people the West was receiving from Russia were either innocent or they were peaceful advocates of political change. They were human rights defenders, human rights activists. The people that Russia got in exchange were outright criminals or spies. And this came through very clearly in the coverage, and it should have, because the main guy in the exchange was a convicted assassin who shot a man dead in a park in the center of Berlin. Two of the people who were released were sitting in federal prison in the United States for some of the biggest cyber crimes in history, right? And they were released because one of them in particular, Seleznyov, was released because his dad is a well-connected politician in Russia. The other one, Klushin, was released because he's a sort of mini oligarch who's also very politically well-connected. So I think all you have to do is look at the sides in this exchange and you get a very clear picture of who's who, right? It's always unpleasant to do deals with an authoritarian regime. No one likes doing that. There are always lots of moral quandaries involved, and we see that again here. But in this case, I think it's really important to remember the words of Vladimir Kara-Murza, my friend, who said, he also understands all the complications of this involved in this exchange, but essentially, let's not lose sight of the fact that these lives were saved. 16 people's lives were saved by bringing them out of prison in Russia. They could have easily died like Alexei Navalny died. Instead, the German government, the US government, allied governments in Slovenia and Norway took the decision to prioritize freeing these prisoners. And I think that's a good advertisement for democracy. I don't see that as a concession or a weakness.
Thank you very much, and I like the reminder of the values on both sides, and that tees it up for you, Ms. Bibin-Sadaka. So your organization, Freedom House, is highly engaged in advocating for the release of political prisoners around the globe, including in Russia. From your experience, why is the inclusion of Russian human rights defenders and opposition leaders so important in this particular prisoner swap, and what do you think this message is, and what does it send?
Absolutely. Thanks for convening this conversation. But building on what Christian said, this is really about those who were released on one side were innocent, those released on the other side were guilty of very, really heinous crimes. But it's not just the innocence, it's also the other point that you made, which is these are people who have dedicated their lives to advocating for democracy, advocating for freedom, advocating for human rights, and it is those actions which got them put in jail. The fact that there were journalists, the fact that there were people who lead human rights and democracy organizations there is not a coincidence. So yes, it was about getting Americans free, but the reason that it's important that Russian human rights activists were included is because the actions, what they have committed their lives to, the reasons that they were imprisoned, is aligned with American foreign policy. They are pushing very much for the same thing that American foreign policy and many other democratic nations are pushing for, which is a regime in Russia that represents the will and the interests of the people, an end to the occupation and the violence that we're seeing in Ukraine and the genocide that is unfolding there. And so what we're seeing is these are people who in many ways are allied. They have different passports, yes, but they're very much aligned with what the United States has been pushing for in Russia, but also in Ukraine.
Thank you very much. Ambassador Herbst, The Kremlin is particularly aggressive when it comes to detaining journalists and members of the free press, such as anyone who engages with content produced by independent media, particularly as it relates to Russia's war in Ukraine and the West. What are the Kremlin's goals in targeting independent media, and what do increasing levels of repression against the media suggest about Putin's regard for international humanitarian norms related to human rights, freedom of the press, freedom of information?
I think it's safe to say that Putin holds in contempt international norms relating to certainly democratic practices or in general humanitarian practices. But the war, his increasing war, and it's an increasing war on real information, which includes on legitimate journalists, reflects his understanding that he is in a struggle. He is trying seriously to reduce American influence, American power, and Western influence and power, and information is part of the struggle. And therefore, he wants to shape the information narrative, or narratives plural. And one way to do that is to staunch the flow of real information. Now, obviously, he has limited means to do that in the West, so that's a serious asymmetric advantage for us, for the good guys. But he can certainly control it within his space, and he can certainly go after individual journalists, certainly Russian journalists, but also Western journalists, as part of that effort. Journalists anywhere, legitimate journalists, always have to take into account not just the requirements of objective reporting, but also their ability to report, their access. And so strong measures against someone like Gershkovich might counsel journalists, other Western journalists in Russia, to be a little bit more circumspect in reporting on the bad behavior of the Kremlin regime. And it also is a warning to anyone inside Russia and anyone within Putin's grasp globally to behave themselves, meaning to report in ways that will not unduly upset the Kremlin. Now, having said all that, and that's all a negative, I think that we're seeing increasing desperation in the Kremlin because their war against the West, and specifically their brutal war, their savage war against Ukraine, is not going very well. So if you can't win on the battlefield, at least try and win on the airwaves or in the printed media. That doesn't fully work, but I think it does explain the fact of increasing repression against the media.
Thank you. Dr. Gozman, what might Putin's motivation have been to agree to such a significant swap, and why was it done now?
Well, thank you. Thank you. I was trying to understand this guy. I understand that he's a war criminal and he's a very bad person, but we must understand his motivation. He needs the loyalty of the special services, because the special services is the background of the system. He has no electoral legitimacy, of course, because there are no elections. And he doesn't think about the entire of the population, because people in Russia has no instruments for transformation their dissatisfaction to political actions. So you can forget about them. But you need the respect of, he needs the respect of special service, of people from special services. His legitimacy for them is the legitimacy of the godfather, of the leader of the mafia. But as a leader of the mafia, as a godfather, he has problems. Well, he is inefficient in Ukraine. He didn't lose the game, unfortunately, but he didn't win. And if he didn't win, it means that he lost. Because he promised them Kiev in 3 days. He promised it, but he failed. Okay, all of them, all people from his special services, they have seen his panic in the days of precautions rebellion. So if he do not release Krasikov, who was carrying out his personal order to kill, it will be a great damage for his image in this group and in all the Russian elite, because Russian elite consists from the 80% consists from the people from special services. And if he doesn't release Krasikov, he has a problem with continuation of the same behavior in the West, because it will be difficult for him to find the new volunteers to kill anybody else. So he has very serious reason to fight for Krasikov, to meet him in the airport, and so on and so on. And of course, the factor of Putin's personal relationships with Krasikov played a significant role as well. So I think that if to look at this situation from his point of view, trying to understand, to be him, so it's very logical and very rational behavior.
Thank you. Dr. Gozman, I also want to touch on the fact that we saw with Gershkovich and Kurmasheva's convictions on the false and contrived charges, with their releases as well, it was particularly notable that both journalists are innocent American citizens. What might the implications be for the U.S.'s approach to the Kremlin and to U.S. policy around Kremlin aggression at home and abroad?
Well, thank you for this question, but I'm afraid I'm not competent enough to answer. So I don't know these respectable persons who are on this table. They know better than myself. I'm not American citizen. I'm just one who like America. But I have. Let me share with you by my concern, a big concern. I'm afraid that after this swap, someone in America will start saying that since it was successful, it means that you can make a deal with President Putin, that he could be the partner in negotiations. Ladies and gentlemen, you cannot deal with Putin. He cannot be the partner. You must win him. You must win him. And it's my concern that people who are for more mild relationships with Putin will receive the new arguments after this success.
Thank you, sir. We'll leave the U.S. politics to the folks at the table, but I think that was an excellent point to highlight. So thank you very much. Ambassador Herbst, did you want to add on anything there?
I'll pass right now.
Okay. Christian. Russia certainly did not walk away empty-handed from this swap. This is yet the latest instance where Moscow gets back spies and even murderers in exchange for innocent journalists and private citizens. This dynamic seems to be a natural advantage for Putin and other authoritarians who are working against the U.S. and allies. Is there any way we can offset this natural advantage the bad guys enjoy, or do we just put up with this unequal situation?
Well, I think Ilya Yashin, one of the dissidents who was freed in the swap, made an excellent point at the press conference in Bonn on Friday when he said that, Chancellor Scholz is being heavily criticized in Germany for letting this murderer go free. How could Germany allow itself to do such a thing? And I think Ilya Yashin made an excellent point when he said, look, Putin and other dictators are going to do this anyway, right? There's very little basis to think we can change that aspect of their behavior by being nice, giving them incentives, or by being tough. They'll still take people if they can take them, right? I think it's really important to keep that fundamental point in mind. I think this exchange, in a certain way, reminds us of a very fundamental thing, which is that there are people in Russia, and quite a few of them, who are opposed to the war, very, very fundamentally, and who are deeply opposed to Putin, and have been willing to put their own lives on the line. It's nothing less than that, to oppose Putin and make clear their opposition. Vladimir Kara-Murza was sentenced to 25 years in prison, okay? And he has said several times since he was freed, I thought I was going to die in prison. Why did he end up in prison? It was because he spoke very clearly and openly about his opposition to the war in Ukraine. Ilya Yashin was put into prison because he criticized the war in Ukraine. Okay, we can get caught up in a lot of other details and political disagreements and things, but these are the fundamental points. These Russian oppositionists, we should see as allies of the Ukrainian people in their struggle against blatant Russian aggression. The Russian soldiers who are dying in Ukraine are dying there because of Vladimir Putin. Ukraine did not start this war, he did. Okay? So these deaths are on him. I think, you know, Ukraine is well advised to make it easier for those soldiers to surrender, right? To give them an out if it's possible to do that. Battlefield conditions don't always allow that, right? But those deaths are really on Vladimir Putin. And I think it's important for us to keep emphasizing that. I think that this was a very, very important moment also simply because it released these incredibly impressive Russian dissidents back into freedom, where they can once again speak out against Putin and against the war. And I think just the living example of these people who have shown that they were really willing to sacrifice everything for their ideals is impossible to overstate, right? So yes, there are a lot of you know, problems and reservations and complications. Were we tough enough with Putin? You know, that's all worth discussing. It's entirely admissible to discuss all that, but let's keep our eyes on the fundamental issue here. These were advocates of freedom who had sacrificed everything, were paying the price, and they were willing to go on paying the price. And thank goodness, now they're in freedom. Let's see them continue their struggle.
Absolutely.
I agree with every word that Christian has said. I think it's important for us as we're in this moment of looking at the swap, looking specifically at this one moment, these specific individuals, we have to widen the aperture. We didn't get here just in one negotiation, one diplomatic. It's not just about these individuals. It is about a much larger struggle that these individuals have really been on the front line of for many, many years. The reason that Vladimir Putin, that Kara-Murza was in such difficult health was because he was imprisoned, but it's also because he was poisoned twice by this regime. This didn't start when he was put in jail. This started many years ago when the regime recognized that a courageous activist like Kara-Murza is a threat to the regime because he is exposing the weaknesses of the regime, exposing the corruption of the regime, and have gone after him and all of these other activists in such tremendous ways. And so I think the question really for us to embrace now is, what more can we be doing to expose the Putin regime for what it is and expose the tactics that they're using across the board at home and abroad, which is an extraordinary important thing for democracies to remember. He has taken the game on the road and is in any way possible extending his repression outside. And so I think that's the broader question that we can be grappling with in addition to this one moment that we're in right now.
That was a great point. Thank you. Okay, folks, our online audience, I see a lot of anonymous questions coming in. We are friendly if you want to put your name, but we will take more anonymous questions as well. And for our in-person audience, we've got a microphone over there. If you want to get over there, I'm going to do one more question for a panelist, and then I will turn it to you. Okay, back to you. So Freedom House has been one of the leading organizations advocating and raising awareness and reminding us about Vladimir Kara-Murza's critical condition and his critical work. Through your position leading one of these organizations that pushed so hard for his release, can you just give us a sense of what these efforts have looked like over the past 2 years? As you said, this is a wider moment.
Absolutely. We've been really fortunate to be able to partner with many, many organizations, with the National Endowment for Democracy, the Bush Institute, McCain Institute, the Free Russia Foundation, many members of Congress, people across the political spectrum, because they recognize how important it was to free these individuals. And particularly our emphasis really was on Vladimir Kara-Murza, because his voice has been so extraordinarily important. He was a resident in the United States in addition to being a Russian and British citizen. And just the opportunity to keep his name on the agenda. That was one of our top priorities. We did it we gave him an award last year, but also just to be able to constantly put his name in the news to remind people how important his voice is. And I also, huge commendations to the Washington Post, obviously was his home, but also Christian's work in just elevating his voice from prison and the strength of being able to elevate that voice. Also pushing for him to be designated as a wrongly detained individual, just because he is a resident here. It was really important to try and push for that. And then obviously just to make sure that he was part of the list, right? Part of the list of people who would be swapped, that this was not just about American citizens or people who were innocent and wrongly detained, but it was really about people who were fighting for the very ideals that we value throughout the world, not just in the United States, but really fighting for democratic standards, which are universal.
Thank you very much, and thank you for all the work that you and Freedom House do. I also want to just give a moment to acknowledge also the work that Freedom House has done in advocating for the political prisoners in Belarus, too. And I want to make sure they're not forgotten as well. And with that, I will turn to our in-person questions. Please say your name and any affiliations as well. And a question, not a comment, is always welcomed. Now, over to you.
Yeah. My name is Samar Chatterjee, Safe Foundation. There is a situation that whenever an American president either doesn't have to run or is a vegetable like Joe Biden, genocidal Joe Biden, he would make a deal like this because that is the right thing to do, okay? So, if those of you who say all the human rights advocates in Russia should be freed, okay, if you do that, more than half the federal prison in the United States would have to be released. So given that situation, because the American federal justice system is a disaster, it's absolutely barbaric,
Is there a
the way
question?
the prosecutors pursue. So therefore, I don't see any solution other than having a vegetable president making a deal.
Was there a question in that?
No.
Okay. Thank you, sir. Ambassador Freed, I'll introduce our next question. I believe you do have a question, sir?
I do. Several people on the panel have made the point that the struggle of the Russian democratic dissidents and the struggle of the Ukrainian patriots is basically the same struggle. And there's a powerful case for that. But in the immediate aftermath of the prisoner exchange, there didn't seem to be a sense of solidarity between the Ukrainians and the Russian dissidents. On the contrary, there were some harsh criticisms from the Ukrainians, some in response to the way the dissidents, the released dissidents themselves, described the Russo-Ukraine war in the press conference on Friday. So my question is, what do you think, is there a genuine solidarity, and what can be done to increase it or to overcome the testiness which was apparent? And I suppose this might be a question for Leonid Nevzlin, but for anyone.
Thank you,
Thank you.
sir. Leonid, do you want to take that?
Yeah, thank you so much, Ambassador Freed. It's a really very serious and very sad problem, I understand Ukrainians. Russia is aggressor. People speaking Russian language, Russians, they kill Ukrainians every day, every minute. They destroy their cities and so on. Look, in 1942, for example, could people in Russia, in the Soviet Union, make a difference between good Germans and bad Germans? All Germans were bad for them. All Germans were fascists. All Germans were enemies. So it's very natural situation. On the other hand, we are real allies. And for example, I don't know, my problems appeared because I said the same. I said that we are aggressors. Ukraine must be free. The Crimea belongs to Ukraine, and so on and so on. So 99.9% of our prisoners are prisoners because they try to protect Ukraine. And the new exchange could be, in my mind, could be only with the participation of Ukraine. If Ukrainians will change some Russian spies or Russian diversants or anybody else to Russian political prisoners, but I don't know, can President Zelensky do it or not? Because many people in Ukraine will criticize him. So I think that this problem has no very fast solution. It's very long problem. It's very long problem. But we must do what we can, and we can, maybe with your help, we can explain to Ukraine, to Ukrainian society, that not all Russians are aggressors, that those people who made terrible crimes on Ukrainian land, they are not all Russians, that those people whom they see on the TV when they applaudize to Putin, when they appreciate the soldiers and so on and so on, they are not all Russians. That Russians are very different. That Russians are very different. I understand that some politicians in Ukraine as well, not only in Ukraine, they're happy to use any mistake of our dissident, of our freedom fighters, any mistake, to explain that, look, all of them are aggressors, all of them hate Ukraine, and so on and so on. But it's not true. It's not true. Those people who are in prison now in Russia, those people whose life could be interrupted any second, they are there because they tried to protect Ukraine, because they were against this terrible war, because they understood that it's a shame. It's a shame for Russia, for Russian culture, for all of us to be in this situation. We, people like me, like myself, we feel ourselves, we think that we feel the same as some Germans felt during the World War II. This feeling of shame, this feeling of horror that our country made such crimes, that our people bomb Odessa and Kiev. It's impossible, but it's reality. So I think that it will be a very, very long process. But what's the good news? The good news is that to persuade some Ukrainians that we are not all of us are aggressors, we do not need to lie. We need just to say the truth, because it's the truth. Not all of us are aggressors. Not all of us are fascists, and not less than 20% of the Russian population is consciously against the war and against Putin. Not less than 20%, and not more than 2 or 3%. These so-called, we call them Z patriots, these crazy guys who wants to kill everybody and so on. And the entire population is people who are indifferent, who is ashamed as well, but they do not think about the war. They do not think about anything. They just do not want to see the real world. But they are not aggressors. They are not criminals.
Thank you very much. Ambassador Herbst.
This is an exceptionally complicated but also important question. I began my answer to your first question, Shelby, by quoting Kluchevsky, who essentially was saying that the Russian people and that victims of Russian aggression abroad share an interest in the demise of any such Russian regime. But this gets lost, again, in the complex history between Ukrainians and Russian, which is largely a history of Russian repression of Ukrainians. I have a great deal of respect for the Russian opposition, and the three who were released were in difficult conditions, and we had to have a little bit of charity towards their public statements, even when those statements are less than helpful. And we have to be even more considerate of Ukrainian considerations, Ukrainian pressures, given the awful behavior of the Russian military forces in Ukraine, principally because of Putin's invasion and things that were unleashed from the top, but also because, as we've seen in social media, the willing participation of Russian soldiers in truly horrific war crimes against the Ukrainian people. So I think tolerance towards those who are essentially on the right side of this fight is critical for us. And it's important that the Russian opposition understand the historical freight that they carry. And it's harder for Ukrainians who are suffering from the savage occupation to show some measure of tolerance, but I would also urge that as well. Oh, that will annoy some of my Ukrainian colleagues and friends. Thank you.
Continuing that train of thought, we've got a question from Maria. A recent press conference with some of the released dissidents has received backlash after they argued for loosening sanctions against Russia. What are your thoughts on this? Anyone want to add on to that?
Well, look, I think we need to frame it. I'm building a little bit on Ambassador Herbst's thoughts there. I think we need to frame it a little bit differently. The priority is for Ukraine to win the war. Okay, that's number one. That's front and center. If you want to topple the Putin regime, the Ukrainian armed forces are the best path to doing that, by defeating Russian forces in Ukraine and hopefully prompting Putin's downfall. That's front and center. Then the next question I would ask is, can Russian oppositionists be good allies of Ukraine in achieving that victory? I believe they can. As Ambassador Herbst pointed out, there's a lot of historical freight here. But I think a lot of Russian oppositionists have proven to be good allies. I think that it can help Ukraine win the war by having allies inside and outside of Russia who can speak to the Russian people over Putin's head in Russian, in a Russian voice in terms that people there can understand, about why this war is such a disaster for Russia itself, okay? And I think that's kind of the way we need to frame it. I fully understand why our Ukrainian friends were teed off by some of the things that were said at the press conference. I think some of those, I can think of a few things that were really not very well phrased, not very helpful. But let's see what they say in the days to come. I think you might hear a changed tone from some of the people who were at that press conference.
I'll just add, just to echo that winning the war in Ukraine is the top priority, and it's not just the top priority for the Ukrainian people who have suffered so extraordinarily brutally in this way, but it really is because it will define many of the questions that are going on globally right now. And I think if Ukraine does not win, and the West and democratic nations around the world does not support Ukraine in that victory, the ramifications will be much wider. And I do think a key part to that is going to be elevating the voices of Ukrainians, of Belarusians, of Russians, of people around the world who recognize the threat that an authoritarian leader like Vladimir Putin and many of the other ones that are allied with him are threatening both to the nations, to those individuals, but really to the world as a whole.
Thank you. Turn to our in-person audience. Please identify yourself and ask your question.
Sure. My name is Doug Klain. I'm with Rosum for Ukraine, as well as a non-resident fellow here at the Atlantic Council. So there are still multiple American citizens being detained by Russia, as well as many, many Ukrainians being held captive by Russia, including more than 19,000 Ukrainian children that have been abducted. After this prisoner swap, do you think there's cause for optimism that more releases can happen, that more people can be freed, or not?
Thank you for the question. Any takers?
I'll jump in. I don't think there is any reason for optimism. Again, this trade was driven first and foremost by Putin's desire to get an assassin out of jail.
Yes.
So you have to have another comparable target of Putin's affections in the custody of the West. I would just make one point, which is perhaps a little bit controversial, and maybe some of my fellow panelists will disagree. Of course, Christian was eloquent on the virtues of Western society, explaining why Putin has an advantage regarding swaps, because he'll just take anybody, whereas we are Democrats who treat people nicely. I think the only way, if we want to avoid such asymmetry in the future, we have to make Putin pay, or any dictator pay, a price for such egregious behavior. And I have two thoughts for consideration. I'm not telling you these are wonderful, these are panaceas, but they should be looked at carefully. One, we can increase the number of Russians we pick up without simply tossing our democratic practices to the wind, by, say, reducing the evidentiary requirements for imprisoning Russian spies. I think we know a lot of Russian spies for whom we don't have top-class evidence that they're spies. Maybe we should reduce that. That's one possibility. The other, again, because we know who these spies are, even if we don't arrest them. Next time the Russians pick up an American school teacher or an American businessman, we toss out 15 Russian spies. If they toss Americans out, no big deal for us. We need to be thinking creatively to change, again, the asymmetric advantage, so that the legitimate criticism, which is not to say this criticism is absolutely right, that we saw, for example, in the Wall Street Journal with this trade, is not repeated ad infinitum.
Thank you. Want to add?
I would also add, I think in this moment where the eyes are all on swap, I think we need to think beyond swap as the primary tool. I'm not taking it off the table, but there are a lot of other ways, right? This is a corrupt regime that has been able to use a lot of banking systems, a lot of other means to really fuel both the aggression that they are waging in Ukraine, but also the repression that they're doing at home. And I think that's where we have to say, how do we put more, like tighten the screws much more on Putin across the board through financial systems, through information to the people in Russia, which they're not getting as much as many people are in a democracy. What are these other tools that we really have to put on the table of the ways to really get at his weakest spots and bring to light the things which many of the journalists who were just released have been doing, but really bring to light the corruption of the regime?
Okay, great. We've got another question in person. Please identify yourself.
Stanley Colbert. I like to look for historical precedents. And the one that occurs to me is the wars of German unification. Bismarck was pan-German, so he has the wars with Austria, with France. He is hoping to reconcile with France, did not happen. Putin, it seems to me, is pan-Slavist. He has the union state with Belarus. He was hoping to bring Ukraine in by force, just as I don't see any reconciliation after this war, just as between Germany and France. That hostility lasted for a century, contributed to 2 world wars. What is the future for Europe if there is no reconciliation? But can any of you see the prospects for reconciliation, given what has happened the last couple of years?
Thank you. All right, Christian.
So I happen to be reading a really fantastic book for an essay that I'm writing by a historian named Frank Trentman, and it's a book about post-1945 Germany. And, you know, if you had asked the gentleman's question in the summer of 1945, the answer would have been there's no possible way that Germany could ever find reconciliation with its European neighbors. It has conducted this criminal war. It has destroyed countless people. It has committed genocide. It has committed war crimes. The preconditions for reconciliation at that moment were absolutely unimaginable. And yet, Germany very gradually and then increasingly went through an extraordinary moral transformation, which was very spotty at the beginning. I mean, there were a lot of Nazis, denazification ended early. A lot of Nazis were restored to high positions, not least by the United States, because we needed them to run the country in the Cold War. You know the story. But if you had asked anyone in the summer of 1945, was that possible, I think you would have gotten 1% of educated observers saying, it's 40 years from now, things are going to be great. Germans will be an accepted part of the European community and everything will be fantastic. Now, will the conditions that existed in Germany after World War II exist in a post-Putin Russia? Very, very hard to say. As Frank Trentman points out, there were a lot of very specific factors. One was the complete and utter defeat of Nazi Germany, so that the whole system was swept away in its entirety. There were no almost no pro-Nazi guerrillas, partisans operating against occupation forces in Germany after May 1945. And a really big one, Germany was completely and utterly defeated, unlike in 1918 when they could claim that they'd been stabbed in the back and so on and so forth. And they were occupied by foreign powers, which is a highly unlikely scenario for a post-Putin Russia. And yet, I have some hope, call me crazy, that what we have today is a Russia where millions and millions and millions of Russia have actually been to other countries. They have seen what life in the democratic world looks like. Yes, I know, their heads are filled with propaganda, very effective propaganda at that. I get it, I understand. But I can't help thinking that history, I also lived in Japan for a while too. Completely incomprehensible how modern day Japan emerged from that fascist, feudalist society that existed right up until 1945. Today, very peaceful, very prosperous, very democratic. So weirder things have happened is all I can say. But I don't think that will be possible, that reconciliation, revival, rehabilitation of Russia will be possible in any form without Russians who understand the need for democracy and who understand how evil and destructive this war that is being conducted in their name has been, right? That's one of the major preconditions. Without people like Vladimir Kara-Murza and Ilya Yashin, I don't see how you get there, ever.
Thank you. And Dr. Gozman, we will turn it to you for the last comment on that.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think that reconciliation is possible. It's really possible, but only without Putin. As long as Putin is power, it will be worse and worse every minute, every day. Because his goal, his real goal, I'm sure, even as a psychologist, I'm sure, that his goal is destroying Ukraine and destroying the Western civilization. He really hates you. After him, it is possible. When Hitler was in power, of course, we had no chances. Only after his defeat, after he was defeated, Germany received the chances. But what are the chances for Russia? Chances for Russia are in Ukraine. The military victory of Ukraine can bring very serious political changes in Russia. And I think that if Ukrainians keep Crimea, for example, it will be the end of Mr. Putin, the end of him. So you can help, I mean the United States of America and the West, give weapons to Ukraine and forget about these strange limits. You can shoot here, but you cannot shoot here. Help them to win. They are ready.
I think that is the perfect note to end on. So thank you for that. Thank you to all of our panelists for your contributions today and also all of your tireless work on these issues. And thank you to our audience. There's a lot more work to do on this topic, so keep an eye on us and we'll do more events for you to join in later. And have a good rest of your day.